In this session, I'd like to talk a little about getting these technologies that we've seen earlier in the other presentations to market and actually getting them into clinical use. For the scope of this talk, I'm going to focus on the PET modality because the other talks in the session have been primarily focusing on PET as the brain imaging modality for molecular imaging. And then I'll give a little overview of the worldwide installed base of scanners and in the US, and some experience that we've had already with bringing dedicated neuro devices to market and making them commercial and generally available. This is also touching on the regulatory situation, and primarily I'll look at the regulatory situation in the US, but I can also comment a little on worldwide regulatory restrictions. So in the world, there's about 6,000 PET CTs installed, give or take, a margin of error plus or minus 500, I'd say. And of these, the vast majority of them are installed in the Americas, about 2,300. But Asia Pacific is catching up fast, and Europe has a large base, and they're coming up fast as well. But if we look at this, 6,000 is not a huge number of scanners. It's not an enormous number of machines. And if we look at scan volume, which I'll get into in a little more depth coming up, we see that the number of neuroscans performed today on these 6,000 scanners is approximately 3%. Now, I mean, that number could be 6 or 7%, it could be 2%, but it's in that range somewhere. And the reason we know this is we have some very precise data about how at least our installed base of scanners are used and what radiopharmaceuticals are sold worldwide. Now, looking into the mix of procedures, oncology currently really dominates PET imaging. So neurology, looking at that small 3% number there. But the total estimated PET scans keep increasing year over year. So the utilization of the modality is high and growing, which also bodes well for availability and trust in the modality for clinical use. And if we look just to the US, there were about just over 2 million clinical PET scans performed in 2019 in the US. Now, this is far fewer than the number of clinical scans for CT or MR, and it's also somewhat of a more costly scan, and I'll get into the economics a little bit later. However, this is a growing number. The 2 million is overwhelmingly oncology right now, but there's a consistent and slightly growing share of neuro in there, which is also somewhat driven by amyloid imaging, which is an emerging imaging for which there's not yet reimbursement, but for which there is a lot of promise for use in the staging of Alzheimer's disease. Now, if we look into that little neuro category, it's kind of equally split up. And you see dementia is about 1%, neurology, in general neurology, seizures about 1%, and the growing part probably right now that we see in this area, or the part we expect a lot of growth, would be in dementia, just because of the patient demographic and the new therapies that we're seeing emerging in the field that would be best staged through some form of amyloid imaging. But there, of course, is a really wide range of what we have that will be paid for. So should we find a strong clinical argument for a neurology scan in PET, it is not as smooth reimbursement path as for oncology. So oncology is almost a straight shot in the US for reimbursement. For neuro, not so much, and we've had quite a few bumps on the road with amyloid imaging so far. And since the reimbursement is limited, of course, clinical adoption is still very low. comment on the IDEAS trial, which was looking at amyloid imaging for Alzheimer's disease with an endpoint of change in patient management for Alzheimer's disease. And this was probably the largest bolus for any single type of neuro scanning that we've done in the US for the last decade, maybe. With a total, I think the total trial is something like 18,000 amyloid scans. And we just registered in 2019 about 6,000 for the IDEAS trial and about 3,500 in 2020. One of the things also that can be a little bit daunting for someone trying to bring a new diagnostic procedure into the PET area is that eventually you will probably be in a situation where you have bundled payment, where the radiopharmaceutical and the procedure and the technical fees are all bundled together in a single payment. And this really puts a lot of cost pressure on the radiopharmaceuticals, which means that for the development of a radiopharmaceutical, one really has to look at the economics to see whether or not there's going to be broad adoption, because there's a very limited profit margin that can be pulled into through a bundled payment. And also institutions are not going to continue to perform a procedure which is draining their finances. A little word on regulatory. If we look at dedicated devices for neuro in PET, most imaging devices would be a standard 510K, so not a lot of overhead in the process. If you do a good GMP compliant, 13485 compliant, which is a international standard development process. And for the actual filing, the regulatory costs are very reasonable, maybe in the 100,000 range for all the work around it. If you have AI claims in there, things tend to get a little more expensive because you need a broader validation. And we're experiencing validation costs for some of the AI claims, especially if you have elements of automated diagnosis, between $500,000 and maybe 1.5 million per incremental version release for something that uses AI and claims some sort of automation to the diagnostic process. A third one's really kind of tricky, and this is attenuation correction. And conventional PET-CT scanners have attenuation correction through the CT that they perform. But if you're going to make a head-only scanner, you might want to do some form of inferred attenuation correction, which doesn't actually require integrating with a CT. And this requires a more thorough validation, especially because the head is not really a great, is easy to model in general, but once you start getting specific, it becomes a little rough. So we also, face these challenges when we introduced MR PET. At least there we had something of a measurable sequence with the Dixon sequences and others that would allow us a good approximation of attenuation correction. If you have a dedicated head-only scanner, it's physically challenging to include a CT. It just doesn't, it would kind of ruin the whole footprint of the system and move the cost up. And it would make algorithmic attenuation correction for neuro much more attractive. But you have a lot of caveats, like individual pathologies, opacified sinuses and such that you have to correct for. So it's not an insurmountable problem, but it's one that would have to be very well validated. And something to the economics of it. Clinical PET-CT is somewhere between 600,000 and 3 million, depending on what you add to it. And the expectation is that you should be able to schedule patients into 15-minute time slots, and that the operative life of the system is going to be at least 10 years. We usually see more than that, up to 15 years, sometimes more. And we actually did build a dedicated system for neuroscanning. And the first one of these went into service, I think, in 1999. Which is kind of amazing because we built 20 of them, and we have about 12 of them that are still in service, so systems that have been in the field for more than 20 years. And this is largely also because of the longitudinal studies that institutions are doing on them, and they have no substitute for it. So there was a market for these. There is a market, but it's really intrinsically tied with research. And one of the leaps that will have to happen is that the image quality for a dedicated neuro system is not competing with the image quality of the 2000 system. It's competing with modern digital SIPM-based systems with small pixels, which from a regular clinical system today, you can generate some very remarkable and high-resolution neuro images. There are a lot of intrinsic advantages to specializing for neuro and scanning that would be able to probably even improve the image quality substantially. And we've seen other talks about that in this session, but still you have a much higher bar than you did perhaps in 2000 for something that would address the research needs. And clearly, if you want to have a strong research program, you need access to radiopharmaceuticals and really on-site access, because a lot of interesting stuff happens with short half-lives like C11. And if you were to go the pharmaceutical development route and you have a tracer for a particular condition that you want to get to market, the cost of that and the regulatory barriers, and this is just looking at the US and is fairly conservative estimate. Assume that you have a tracer that meets the needs for a condition that it has an unmet diagnostic need, and the condition is reasonably broad. One would have to assume you need about 3 to 5 years for the trials, and that's going to be at least $20 to $50 million from the point where you have a well-developed, well-researched tracer with academic validation. And just a note on positron emitters. A lot of the time we talk about the short and medium half-life stuff like C11, a very short half-life, but it's a very friendly positron emitter. Not a lot of ancillary radiation coming off of that. And fluorine is the same thing. But not all interesting biological processes work within these shorter half-lives. And sometimes you want to look at processes over a longer period of time. And then you're talking about things like zirconium and copper. And then sensitivity becomes very important. And you have sometimes a lot of collateral exposure, especially when you talk about zirconium. So you want to be able to use very small doses of it and observe activity over an extended period of time. When we talk about extended period of time, we mean days, which might better match to a particular biological process that we want to measure. And if you would ask me the question, what would you do to build a dedicated neuroscanner commercially? And it may not be that it is the commercial market we address. You could also look at the research market. But in general, I think for a dedicated scanner, first off, it's very simple. The advantages of being a dedicated scanner must outweigh the limitations, and that's particularly the bore size, because you get a lot of advantages from the small bore, but naturally you lose the ability to be a general purpose scanner. If we were to look at something like the proliferation of amyloid testing and then a high demand for amyloid testing, I think this would push more towards a lower cost in-office type of scanner than a higher cost research capable machine. So there's a little bit of a balance there. Some clinical conditions may not drive towards the capabilities that would best support research. And if we don't have CT or any sort of transmissive attenuation correction, you need a really robust automated solution. And on top of that, probably the final thing, to understand dynamic behaviors, I think you would want to be able to integrate a good solution for the measurement of input functions for dynamic and parametric PET. So there are challenges to reaching the commercial space. It's been done before, we've done it before, others have, but it will be a real question. I think that would be my final point, to go towards a really high volume clinical approach or one that satisfies the research demand. And I think those would fundamentally take you in different directions. Thank you.